Nightmare Ski Trip. Lily's first big skiing trip. She and her friend rented a cabin in Snowmass, right next to the Aspen Mountain Ski Resort. It was her first time snowboarding, and although she had faced a few challenges on the slopes, she was eager to explore the area more with her friends. She got separated from Amy when she decided to take a break on the mountain, and a man approached her. He mentioned how he wasn't used to seeing many beautiful girls like her here. What she found strange was that her face was mostly hidden by her ski mask. Lily lied, telling him she was with her boyfriend to make him stop. But something unnerved her when he mentioned having seen her and her friend arrive. Lily didn't think much more about it, pretending she hadn't heard anything, and snowboarded away. It was also when she felt she was snowboarding better than ever. That morning, she returned to the mountain alone to practice. Halfway down, she saw a man from a distance. This time, she hid behind a nearby tree and observed. He was wearing the same jacket and ski boots as the man she met before. But then she noticed something unmistakable, a jagged scar over his eye, which Lily clearly remembered from the way he had looked at her so eerily. That's when she noticed his bag, slung over his shoulder, with a keychain bearing the letter J hanging from it. She felt everything growing strange and ominous, as if by instinct, so she called Amy to leave quickly. When she returned, ready to leave, a snowstorm began outside, trapping them and making it impossible to leave. She grew anxious and scared, locking all the doors. But when night fell, things started to get strange. Later that night, they went to their rooms to sleep. Lily, unable to sleep, stayed up looking at her phone. The house was quiet, but the eerie silence was broken by footsteps on the wooden floor. The sound grew louder, and then she heard something that sent chills down her spine. The doorknob turning. It wasn't her friend, it was someone else. She sat up and called out for Amy. No one answered, and panic started to set in. But she paused, wondering why they were trying to enter her room. She tiptoed to the door, pressed her ear against it, and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was stifling. Lily quietly unlocked the door and turned the knob, pushing it open as gently as possible. When she cracked the door open, she saw a tall man moving around the house. His shadowy figure loomed in the dim light as he seemed to try to enter their rooms. At first, she couldn't make out his features, but then, under the faint moonlight from the window, she recognized him, the man with the scar over his eye, who had said strange things to her on the mountain. He was also carrying the bag with the J keychain. Terrified, Lily gently shut the door and locked it. She grabbed her phone and quietly called 911, whispering into the phone to avoid being detected. Then, the knocking began deliberate at first, then louder and more forceful. The man was trying to get into her room. She couldn't take it any longer. Lily shouted,
"Get out!"
She yelled, telling the man she had called 911. The banging stopped, and she heard his voice from the other side of the door.
"All right, girl."
His footsteps grew fainter as he walked away. Lily and her friend stayed locked in the room, terrified. Only when the police arrived a few minutes later could they confirm the intruder had left. The next day, Lily noticed something that made her heart race. A keychain had been left on the floor near the front door, possibly dropped by the intruder during his attempt to enter her room. Forensic experts collected it as evidence and found fingerprints on it. They analyzed the prints and matched them to a man with a criminal record known for breaking in, stalking, and harassment. Although the police had a lead, they had not yet located the intruder. The case remained open. Back home, Lily couldn't shake the thought that the man was still out there. She didn't know how he had found them, how long he had been following them, or what he might plan next. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area. miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills. But I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter-mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing and had started down alone. My eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared. He was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied,
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
"She's stealing from me. Stop her."
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The Hitchhiker's Trap. This happened in the winter of 1993, when Keely was 20 years old. It was 1:30 May, when Keely finished her shift at the factory and stopped at a gas station to fill up her smoking car. The gas station was nearly empty, except for a few cars parked in the distance. While Keely was pumping gas, a woman began approaching. She appeared to be around Keely's age, approaching with a frightened, distressed, and anxious look. The woman spoke hurriedly, out of breath. She said she had argued with her boyfriend and needed to use a payphone to call a friend for a ride. Keely listened, but her unease grew as the woman explained that she had been harassed and feared the men in a light green car parked next to the gas station's dumpster. Initially hesitant, Keely noted that the woman was dressed neatly and wasn't drunk or anything similar. She just seemed genuinely anxious and scared. So, after finishing her refueling, Keely told her to get in the car. As they drove down a dark, quiet street, Keely asked where the woman lived. The woman kept glancing into the rearview mirror, fidgeting in her seat. She didn't answer Keely's question, just mumbled something incomprehensible. Then she asked Keely to take her to a house not far away on the edge of town. When they arrived, it looked unusual, almost abandoned. Keely asked skeptically, "You live here?" She simply told Keely the house was under renovation and asked her to wait outside for a moment. Keely reluctantly got out of the car and leaned on the hood. She called back, asking Keely to help her. Still trying to make sense of everything, Keely reluctantly agreed and approached the porch. However, as Keely neared the house, a sense of hesitation crept over her. Something about this house, and the woman felt off. Just as she reached out to touch the doorknob, a loud bang erupted behind her. Time seemed to freeze, and she felt a sharp pain at the back of her head. Everything spun as the pain surged, and the next thing she knew, she was collapsing onto the ground in front of the porch. Keely's vision blurred, but she could still see the woman standing over her with a smug smile. "Thanks for the help," she said, as darkness consumed Keely, punctuated by her chilling laughter. When Keely woke up, her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with rope. Her head throbbed with pain as she lay on the floor of a dark, filthy room reeking of mildew. Keely didn't dare move, but observed what was happening. The woman sat on a chair not far away, holding up her phone on a video call. "You should mind your own business," she said, not even glancing at Keely. Keely regained her vision and focused on the phone screen. It was a man standing next to a car, the same one she had seen at the gas station. He said he'd pick her up soon to catch more victims. She realized everything from the start had been a trap. Keely struggled against her restraints, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. Despite the pain, Keely, being the only woman at the plastic factory, had learned to handle such situations. She relied on her experience to quietly inspect and work on her restraints. Finally, the rope loosened slightly, but the woman began approaching Keely, so she decided to stay still, pretending nothing was amiss. When the woman seemed to sense something, she moved closer to Keely. The moment arrived, Keely sprang up, elbowing her in the face. She turned and kicked the woman hard with her bound feet, causing her to stumble painfully to the ground. That gave Keely the chance to free her legs and run outside. Keely dashed outside and got into her car. As she frantically started the engine, the woman suddenly appeared with a menacing smile. Somehow, she had gotten into Keely's car. "Mind giving me a ride?" Just as the car started, the woman, not wearing her seatbelt, was thrown forward as Keely hit the accelerator. Keely pushed the woman out of the car and drove off, calling the police to have them arrested. When Keely finally got home, she told her sister about the harrowing encounter. While relieved that Keely was safe, her sister scolded her for not going to the police immediately. After a few days of investigation, the police arrested the two criminals. Keely couldn't believe what had happened, but at least she had survived. And she learned a terrifying lesson about the hidden dangers in seemingly harmless situations. Escape from the terrifying snowstorm night. This happened a few New Year's Eves ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. A simple trip. I was used to long drives. Snow started falling about an hour into the drive. Light at first, but it kept coming until I found myself in the middle of a snowstorm. The highway grew slippery, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, a small one, wasn't built for driving in the snow. The tires slid even on the smallest incline, and I realized I needed to stop. I texted my parents about my situation to reassure them, but honestly, I wasn't so sure myself. An hour passed, and the snow only got worse. I began worrying about running out of gas or draining the battery by keeping the heater on too long. I kept the engine running, hoping the storm would ease. The wind howled outside. I began to feel the weight of isolation when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm behind me. I felt an overwhelming relief as a snowplow stopped beside me. Finally, someone had come to help. The truck slowed and stopped beside me. It was the driver, a man leaning out the window. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a thick coat and a black knit cap pulled down over his ears. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had smoked for years.
"Are you okay?"
he asked. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, and he said to get in, that he'd take me somewhere safe. He got out of the truck. I hesitated. I didn't know this man, and he seemed a little strange, but he appeared sincere. The storm was relentless, and staying wasn't an option. "All right," I replied, then asked if he could take me to my destination. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting quickly behind my car, as if looking for something. Then, without a word, he told me to get in. The warmth inside the snowplow was a relief compared to the biting cold outside. We didn't talk much during the ride, but as the minutes passed, I began to sense something strange. As I glanced out the window, I realized we weren't heading toward my parents' house. The surroundings looked unfamiliar. A lingering unease crept in. I asked, trying to sound casual, "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't look at me and said it was a shortcut. At least GPS showed we were going the right way, so I figured I was just being paranoid. I glanced around the truck. Everything was a mess. empty whiskey bottles and torn maps stuffed into the side compartments. My eyes stopped at something wedged between the seats, a knife, half hidden under the chair. Suddenly, I saw a small house ahead, the only house I'd seen after a long stretch of emptiness. I knew I had to act before something bad happened. A sense of foreboding washed over me. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. I flung the door wide and ran into the snowstorm. The blizzard made visibility almost zero. The thick snow slowed my steps, but I pressed on toward the faint light of the wooden house. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. The snowplow driver didn't give up. He rummaged through the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun, yelling,
"Get back here! You're not going anywhere!"
As I neared the house's door, he fired the gun. I thought I'd used up all my luck when the bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a painful wound. Staggering, I banged on the wooden door, shouting for help. A man appeared with a shotgun in hand. Before I could explain, he seemed to understand and quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut. He stayed outside, shouting, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He fired the gun again, the bullet shattering a large piece of the window. The hunter, with no other choice, opened the door and charged outside with the shotgun. The two of them wrestled in the blizzard, the gun falling from their hands. I couldn't just stand there. Before he could act, I picked up the shotgun and aimed it straight at him. As he hesitated, the hunter took the opportunity to tackle him to the snow-covered ground and tied him up with a rope. A short while later, the police arrived, and he was arrested. I was so grateful to the hunter for saving me, and relieved I had made the right decision to jump out of that truck. The terror on Christmas Eve. This incident happened on Christmas Eve, the year Lena was 13. Since she only lived with her dad, and her family usually either didn't celebrate or celebrated Christmas late, she was used to this. For Lena, Christmas Eve was just like any other night. Her dad was a doctor, so he always had to be on call at the hospital during Christmas holidays. That night was no exception. He wasn't home. Lena was watching TV when she heard a knock at the door, so she went to see who it was. Her front door had a peephole, making it easy to see who was outside. A man stood outside wearing a Santa Claus suit, holding a bag and smiling, waving at Lena to open the door. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look neat at all. Lena approached the door, but didn't open it. She found it odd that someone dressed as Santa Claus would come to her house, of all the houses in the neighborhood. He said,
"Hey kid, it's me, Santa Claus. Let me in, and I'll show you."
Maybe other kids would believe him, but Lena knew he wasn't real. Confused and skeptical, because this had never happened before, Lena refused to open the door. The man insisted, saying he had changed the rules this year to give gifts to kids in the neighborhood. But Lena didn't believe him. Instead, she remembered feeling angry while arguing with him. Lena told him she was calling the police. His smile disappeared, and after that, she didn't hear anything else. To be sure, Lena called the police to report him. Unfortunately, they probably didn't believe her and thought she was just an excited kid, hoping Santa Claus would visit. She only knew how to dial 911 and the house number, since it was the 90S and her dad didn't have a mobile phone yet. Lena could only hope the man wouldn't return. But a few minutes later, someone knocked again. When Lena checked, no one was there. She returned to the Christmas tree to continue decorating and wrapping gifts as a surprise for her dad. Lena turned on the TV to watch Christmas specials, which made her feel less lonely. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving the house in darkness. Lena jumped in fright. Now, The only light in the house came from the battery-operated Christmas tree. Then she heard the back door creak open. From the doorway emerged a dark silhouette, slowly advancing. It was the figure of a man. Lena grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and shone it towards the figure. The face revealed was his, the man from earlier, leaning close to her with a sinister grin.
Here's your surprise gift, little one,
he sneered. Lena screamed and ran toward the back door, but she couldn't outrun him. He grabbed her hand and yanked her back. Lena sobbed and screamed, begging for mercy, but he showed no remorse. He taped her mouth shut and began tying her up with rope. As her vision blurred, he stuffed her into a large sack he had brought with him and hoisted it over his shoulder. Lena's next-door neighbor, who was walking his dog, happened to see the man. His actions seemed suspicious. The neighbor remembered that Lena lived alone with her father, who was often away, and her father had occasionally asked him to check on her. He cautiously approached with his dog and asked,
"What are you doing out here at this hour? Is everything okay?"
The man, startled, quickly forced a smile and replied,
"Oh, I'm just preparing a surprise for the kids in the neighborhood."
The man hurriedly hid the sack behind his back, stepping away as his eyes darted around. His strange behavior only heightened the neighbor's suspicions. His dog kept barking, as if trying to warn him of something. It was a smart dog, good at sensing trouble. The neighbor noticed the sack behind the man seemed to be moving slightly. Sensing the man was odd, the neighbor remained cautious. He apologized for bothering him and pretended to head back toward his house. He then heard a faint sound resembling crying and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the man and shoved him hard, causing him to fall onto the grass. The sack fell, and Lena tumbled out onto the grass, her eyes wide with terror. The man tried to flee, but the neighbor quickly pinned him to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. The man remained on the ground, handcuffed and arrested. Lena was safely escorted back home by her neighbor. Her father returned home immediately after hearing the news. That night, Lena learned the true meaning of fear. She hugged her father tightly, knowing she was lucky to have survived a terrifying Christmas Eve. The Ghost Train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here. but they cannot leave. To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move. His head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. Mystery buried under the snow. Rian had never truly clicked with Tyler, but they were still friends. Their relationship had always been complicated, marked by their differences in personality. Tyler was a complex, reserved guy with hidden corners of his life he never let anyone see. On the other hand, his mother, Diane, was the opposite, controlling, invasive, and suffocating. She seemed like a constant weight on his shoulders, though Tyler never outright said so. Their mother-son relationship might seem normal at first, but something about it never truly felt right. Diane constantly monitored Tyler with endless calls, texts, and surprise visits. He was never truly at ease during outings with friends, always explaining that he couldn't stay long because his mother would worry. When Tyler finally moved out, Rian thought things would change for him. Diane paid his rent, of course, so she couldn't entirely let go, but Tyler initially seemed more at ease. But that didn't last. He started avoiding people, skipping gatherings, and dodging calls. Rian thought Tyler was just adjusting to his new life, but one day, Rian ran into him. "Tyler, looking exhausted, waved him over and asked for help fixing a leaking faucet. When Rian entered Tyler's apartment, everything seemed normal at first. However, there was an unsettling heaviness in the air. He noticed the backyard through the kitchen window was unusually dark. At first, Rian thought it was someone in the yard, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a massive snowman. Rian frowned, jokingly pointing at it.
Who makes a snowman that big?
Tyler didn't reply, merely gesturing for him to focus on the faucet. Rian stepped into the kitchen, scanning the area for the faucet. As he approached the sink, something caught his attention. Tiny blood-red spots on the floor near the sink, scattered unevenly. At first, he thought Tyler had cut himself while cooking or something similar. That's not unusual for someone as clumsy as him. At first, they weren't clear, but upon closer inspection, something seemed off. The stains weren't random. They seemed to form a trail leading out to the yard. His brows furrowed in confusion, but he didn't react immediately. Tyler stood nearby, distant, as if lost in thought, staring blankly at the TV. As Rian knelt down to continue inspecting the faucet, something faintly glinted under the sink, catching his attention. It was a shiny keychain, stained with dried blood. Rian's hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, immediately recognizing it. It belonged to Diane, Tyler's mother, the one she always carried with her. Panic set in as he realized something was wrong. At that moment, Rian turned and saw Tyler, even though he'd heard him in the living room just seconds earlier, seemingly watching TV. His expression was blank, and he seemed unfocused.
Why is there blood on this? What's going on?
Tyler stayed silent, his gaze distant, as if calculating something. Before Rian could react, Tyler reached across the table and grabbed a kitchen knife. His movements were slow but deliberate.
You're not allowed to leave.
Tyler lunged at Rian with the knife. Instinctively, Rian stepped back but tripped over a chair, falling to the floor. Tyler raised the knife again, stepping forward with clumsy but determined strides. Rian raised his hands to defend himself, bracing for the worst. Tyler aimed for Rian's chest. Rian twisted on the ground, narrowly avoiding the blade. Tyler staggered, and that's when Rian noticed it. The keychain was still in his hand.
Wait, Tyler, calm down.
Rian shouted, but Tyler lunged again. In a desperate move, Rian stabbed Tyler's leg with the blood-stained keychain. Tyler screamed in pain, stumbling back as he looked down at his leg. Rian seized the opportunity to get up and run toward the back door. He stumbled into the giant snowman. The impact caused it to collapse, revealing a horrifying sight beneath, a pale, trembling hand. And then the fingers twitched. It was Diane.
Help.
She whispered weakly. She clung to his coat, her eyes filled with tears.
I wanted him to be happy.
Rian dragged Diane toward the patio, his arms trembling with the effort. Rian turned to see Tyler, now staggering and disoriented, looking toward them. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably.
I just wanted to fix everything.
The sound of sirens tore through the night as the police arrived. Tyler didn't resist as they surrounded him. He just sat there, his head in his hands, mumbling incoherently. The investigation revealed Tyler's mental breakdown. In a twisted effort to conceal his mother, he had hidden Diane inside the snowman. Tyler was sentenced to life in a mental institution, his mind damaged beyond repair. The snowman was something Rian could never forget, the desperation of Tyler and the suffering of Diane. In the freezing cold of winter, he could never look at a snowman the same way again. The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
"I see you."
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
"I see you."
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party. and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside, it still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
Come closer.
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed, but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again, I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away, and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open, and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. Night at the gas station. That night, snow fell, freezing cold. The wind howled as I drove into the parking lot of the gas station where I worked the night shift. I had been doing this job for a few months now, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., as it fit my personal schedule. My coworker's car was the only other vehicle in the lot. I parked next to it, bracing myself for a long night. Nothing but slow hours and an empty store ahead. After greeting my coworker and taking over his shift, I was alone for the rest of the night. As soon as the door closed behind him, I glanced at the task list my manager had left. It was short, just a few tasks that would take less than an hour to complete. Around midnight, a car pulled into the station, catching my attention. It was an old SUV, pulling up to one of the gas pumps. I glanced out the window for a moment before turning back to my phone. A few minutes passed, then 10. I glanced again, surprised to see the SUV still parked there. The headlights were off, the doors closed, but no one had come in to pay or use the restroom. A strange feeling began to creep over me. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the freezing cold, the wind biting into my skin. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the SUV. I peered through the window, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" But from what I could see through the frosted glass, the car was empty. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the growing unease. There was no one in the SUV. But why would someone leave a car parked there, engine off, in freezing temperatures like this? I glanced down and noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They led away from the car, but not toward the front of the station. Instead, they extend toward the corner of the gas station. It was too cold for someone to just walk off and disappear like that. I hurried back inside to warm up. Once inside, I turned on the small heater next to the counter. Then a loud noise came from the back of the building. I turned around, looking through the rows of shelves in the station. Empty, nothing there. Slowly, I started walking toward the noise coming from the back of the gas station. There on the floor were small puddles of dirty water, the kind that could only come from melted snow. I followed the trail, leading me to the storage room in the back. I stopped at the door, and in the dim light of the storage room, I saw a figure half hidden among the shelves. He was standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard that gave him a disheveled, intimidating look. He was staring right at me. I stood frozen, trembling. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? Then he moved slightly, stepping forward. Instinctively, I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to defend myself with. My fingers touched a metal crowbar leaning against the wall. I gripped it tightly. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" But he didn't answer. As I raised the crowbar, the cold metal felt heavy in my hand. I warned him, telling him to back off or I'd call the police. He took another step forward. I screamed louder in desperation, "I'm warning you." I swung the crowbar through the air. He staggered back, slipping on the wet floor. He groaned, clutching his leg as if he twisted it in pain. The opportunity was there, and I didn't miss it. I bolted back to the front of the store. I ran to the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I picked up the store phone and whispered to 911 for help. Every second felt like an hour as I waited. My eyes locked on the storage room door. When the police arrived, I pointed them to the back. 2 officers cautiously entered, flashlights raised as they swept the storage room. I expected to hear them shout out, telling me they'd found him, but instead, they emerged with puzzled looks on their faces. They found wet footprints leading out the back door, disappearing into the snow-covered forest behind the gas station. They followed the trail, but the vast, dark expanse seemed to swallow everything. He had vanished, leaving only a mystery. The SUV had been towed away. I still work the night shift, but every time I hear a noise from the back or see a car pull into the station, I get more cautious. He could be out there, watching, waiting. But one thing is certain, I was lucky to survive that night. Night at the gas station. The return. The memory of that snowy night still lingers in my mind. It's been over 2 weeks, and the police are still searching for him. Since then, unease has stayed with me. I've become more cautious, more aware of every detail. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. Light snow fell tonight, and the parking lot was empty. No cars, no customers, only the constant hum of the station lights and the heater struggling to keep the cold at bay. I gazed out the window, just like I had every night since then. I decided to keep busy with the small tasks my manager had left me. Stocking shelves, wiping the counter, anything to keep my mind occupied. As I bent down to organize some snacks, I heard it. A soft creaking sound from the back. It was the same sound I had heard that night, the one that led me to the storage room. I stood up slowly, waiting, listening for more. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I began to relax, headlights swept across the parking lot. A car slowly pulled in. It was the same type of SUV again. I froze, watching it stop near the gas pump. I grabbed my coat, knowing I couldn't avoid this. A feeling of dread crept over me as if everything was about to happen again. I stepped outside, the cold wind biting my face as I approached the SUV. I cautiously peered inside. This time, there was someone inside. A man wearing a thick coat, his face partially obscured by a knit hat. I asked, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond right away. He slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate. Then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "I am here for what I left behind." Before I could respond, he opened the car door and stepped out. He was tall and moved toward me, and instinctively, I took a step back. I ran inside, slamming the door shut. My fingers fumbled for my phone to call the police. I gasped as I told them, "He's back. The man from before. Please send help." I glanced around, looking for the crowbar I had used before. It was leaning against the wall near the counter. I grabbed it tightly as I heard the man approach the entrance. The door rattled as he tried the handle, but it was locked. Then I heard him move toward the back door. I crept toward the storage room. The back door was still shut, but I knew he was out there. I could hear him moving, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Suddenly, the door handle began to shake. I backed away, gripping the crowbar. The door creaked open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air. I could see his silhouette. It was still him. The scruffy beard, the broad shoulders. His eyes fixed on me, wild and crazed. This time, I didn't wait. I swung the crowbar. He ducked, barely dodging the blow. I swung again, and this time, I hit his arm. He groaned in pain, staggering back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged at me, grabbing the crowbar with a force I didn't expect. The metal slipped from my hands and fell to the ground. I stumbled back. Then I saw my chance the exit, and I ran as fast as I could toward it. I ran outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I could hear him behind me. I sprinted toward the forest, needing to get away from him. Branches whipped against my face as I rushed into the woods, the cold biting into my skin, causing sharp pain. I tripped. My foot caught in a tree root hidden beneath the snow. It sapped all the strength out of me. I tried to get up, but before I could move, I felt his hand grab my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked out, sending him staggering with a cry of pain. I got up and kept running toward the edge of the woods. In the distance, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, pointing toward the forest. "He's still in there." At that moment, he came running out of the woods as the police closed in. For a split second, the crazed smile on his face vanished. He turned to run, but it was too late. The police were right in front of him. He thrashed and squirmed violently as they wrestled him to the ground and cuffed him. The SUV had been towed away, and the man was gone, but the unease remained. The store was quiet again. I walked to the door, staring out at the now empty parking lot. I didn't know why he had come back, what he was after, or what he thought he'd left behind, but I hoped it would be the last time I saw him. The deadly delivery. Have you ever felt like this might be the moment you die? If not, consider yourself lucky, because that's exactly what happened to me last week. I work at a local pizza shop. My job involves taking orders and delivering pizzas to customers during the night. I've always worked night shifts and never had any issues until last week. I was standing near the counter when the shop phone rang. The man on the line ordered 2 large pizzas and gave an address to a house on the outskirts of town. The man's rude behavior over the phone annoyed me, but I let it slide and started preparing for the delivery. I asked the cook to prepare the order. I checked the address on GPS and realized it would take me 20 minutes to drive there. I was driving through small towns. It was 10 p.m., so the streets were completely deserted. I spotted a house at the end of the street and realized it was the location. I parked near the house and stepped out. The house looked quite abandoned, as if no one lived there. I walked to the front door and knocked. I heard the door creak open after a few seconds. A rough-looking, angry man with a scruffy beard stood in the doorway. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. He asked, "What do you want?" I realized this was the same guy who had insulted me over the phone. I calmly said, "Here's your pizza," and handed him the boxes. The man eyed me up and down before paying me and slamming the door in my face. I walked back to my car and was about to start the engine when a sound caught my ear. It took me a moment to realize what it was. I strained to listen carefully and realized it was the sobbing of a little girl. I looked around but saw no one. Then I realized the crying was coming from the house I had just delivered the pizzas to. At first, I thought it might be his daughter. It could have been a private family matter, but there was something in the girl's cries, like she was begging me not to leave. I slowly got out of my car and tiptoed closer to the front door, trying to listen to the sounds coming from the house. The girl's sobbing continued, but this time I heard 2 more voices. I heard 2 men speaking in hushed tones, their voices raspy, though I could almost make out everything they said. The angry drunk man was yelling at another man, "I told you to shut the girl's mouth tightly." The other man replied, "I did, but she won't stop sobbing." They argued, their voices filled with profanity. The girl's sobbing grew louder. There was a small window on the porch. I slowly peeked inside, and what I saw terrified me. A little girl lay on a dusty mattress on the floor, her hands and feet bound, her mouth taped shut, her wide eyes filled with terror. The entire situation became clear to me. They were kidnappers, and this little girl was their captive. The house was likely abandoned, which is why they chose it as their hideout. I got back into my car, honestly terrified, and thought about just leaving. I figured it was better to let the police handle it, but I realized how dangerous it would be to leave the girl there. So, I called 911. The nearest station said they'd arrive in about 20 minutes. I stepped out and began moving toward the back of the house. When I reached the back door, I saw the 2 men heading upstairs, leaving the girl on the floor. I told myself this was my only chance. Luckily, the back door had a small pet flap. I reached through and turned the knob. Slowly, the door opened. The men were still arguing upstairs. I quietly made my way into the living room. I reached the girl. At first, she was terrified, but I reassured her, gesturing for silence and whispering that I was there to help her escape. I told her the police were on their way. She nodded tearfully. I started untying her, but suddenly I heard hurried footsteps. It was one of them. I immediately picked the girl up and began running toward the door. The bastard pulled out a large knife and chased us. As I neared the exit, he stabbed me in the leg. I screamed in pain, but I couldn't stop. The girl began crying and screaming in fear when she saw blood pouring from my leg. I held her tightly and ran as fast as I could. The streets were empty, and the next house was far away. I knew I couldn't make it that far. I prayed to God, begging for the police to arrive before they caught us. My hope of survival was slipping as I began to lose consciousness, but then I saw red and blue lights coming toward us. The sound of sirens made me breathe a sigh of relief. I passed out. I spent a week in the hospital. The police reunited the girl with her parents and arrested the kidnappers. The doctor told me I might have a limp for the rest of my life, but when the little girl visited me in the hospital, her smile and the happy tears on her parents' faces made every bit of pain worth it. I was happy to have saved a child's life that night, delivering pizza. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, But then I noticed something strange. A note hastily written in black ink, taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The Dark Truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
You will die, as I did.
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. Driving down the dark stretch of road, those words kept echoing in his mind.
You will die, as I did.
Growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. He felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, they uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. Take the wrong Uber driver. It was late November, and we had a small party. I stumbled out of the bar into the freezing cold air. I stood on the sidewalk, the world around me spinning slightly, my mind foggy from the alcohol. My friends stayed behind, eager to celebrate a little longer, but I had a flight to catch the next morning. I needed to pack. I needed to sleep, so I booked an Uber to take me home. I opened the app, and luckily, a driver accepted almost instantly. The app showed it would arrive in 4 minutes. Then, a car pulled up. The car's headlights flashed at me. From a distance, I thought I saw someone wave at me from the window. I was tired, and maybe my app was just glitching. The driver must have arrived early, that's all. Without thinking much, I stumbled into the car. Inside, the car smelled faintly of old cigarettes, and the seat creaked beneath me. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. He didn't look back at me, didn't say a word. He didn't even confirm my name. I just wanted to get home. I muttered my address and leaned back in the seat. It was then that I noticed the GPS on his dashboard was turned off. I was startled. Why hadn't he entered my address into his GPS? Everyone uses GPS for Uber, even drivers familiar with the area. I watched him drive, hoping he just knew the route well. The car sped down the street, but something felt off. This wasn't the way to my dorm. I nervously told him,
"I think you're going the wrong way. My school is in the opposite direction."
For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded, but he didn't turn the car around. He just kept driving. I started to panic. Where was he taking me? The car stopped in front of a rundown office building. The street was deserted. Why had he stopped here? He didn't say a word. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut. My mind raced. My hands trembled as I slowly pulled out my phone. My heart sank when I saw the missed calls from my actual Uber driver. I'd gotten into the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. I was in danger. I needed to get out now. I quickly sent my location to a friend via text. If I called the police, he might hear me. But then I heard a slow, low chuckle. I looked up through the window, and there he was, smirking at me, staring. He circled the car. My hand moved toward the door, pressing down the lock. He hadn't noticed. I frantically moved from door to door, locking each one in a frenzy. The faint noise alerted him. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed in anger. He stepped closer to the driver's door, his hand reaching for the handle. When it didn't open, he angrily pulled it, yelling, "Open the door!" I knew I only had a few seconds left. Desperate, not waiting any longer, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, hoping they could get there faster. I didn't get a chance to speak. The sound of glass shattering stopped me, and I screamed as I saw him punch the window with his bare hand, glass flying everywhere. His arm pushed through the broken window. I dropped my phone, desperately trying to get away from him, clutching the door handle on the other side, frantically unlocking it to escape before he could grab me. I ran as fast as I could since he was injured and stuck with his hand in the broken window. I couldn't stop. I stumbled but kept running, my body filled with overwhelming terror. The night was pitch black, with the only light coming from the distant glow of the city. The abandoned lot stretched endlessly, nowhere to hide. But I kept running, praying that somehow I would survive. I spotted a small store up ahead, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the distance. My legs burned, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the store. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. The store clerk stared at me, wide-eyed in surprise. But I was thankful I had escaped him. The police arrived minutes later. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the office building where the car had been parked. But when they got there, the car and the man were gone. Only shattered, blood-stained glass remained. The police reassured me that they would search for him. It was a hard lesson learned that I must always be more careful when going out alone, especially when I'm not fully alert. Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Kala hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through. The cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Kala sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area, where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Kala turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror, but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Kala's fear surged. She raised her voice.
"This isn't the way to my dorm."
But the driver didn't hear, or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Kala curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Calla hard.
Wait!
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Calla,
"When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately."
Calla stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Calla made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Calla rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Calla explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Calla frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Calla picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her, reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments. The eccentric stranger in the hotel. Kit always remembers that terrifying day. It was the day she and her family went to a small 3-star hotel in the suburbs to celebrate her sister Judy's 16th birthday. Kit's father had arranged everything, and they checked into a room on the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and since there were not enough pillows in their room, Kit had to go down to the reception to ask for more. She locked the door and headed toward the elevator. That's when she saw him. At first, she didn't notice the man sitting in the corner of the hallway because it was so dark, just a shadowed figure sitting there. As she got closer, needing to pass him to reach the elevator, she could see him more clearly. His hair was disheveled, his coat was filthy and torn, and he was muttering to himself while holding a handful of small stones, counting them one by one. As Kit walked by, she accidentally locked eyes with his bloodshot gaze, and slowly, he gave her a deranged smile. She quickly averted her eyes and hurried to the elevator. She collected the pillows from the reception and stepped into the stairwell to return to her room. The memory of the encounter sent a shiver down her spine, filling her with anxiety. As the door opened on the 3rd floor, Kit's worst fear was confirmed. He was still sitting there, her face darkened with unease. He remained in the same spot, humming to himself as he toyed with the stones. Kit tried to walk quickly past him, but then she heard footsteps behind her. A sinking feeling hit her he was following her. She didn't dare look back again. The faster Kit walked, the quicker he followed. He began giggling, and the sound of the stones rattled throughout the hallway. She reached her sister Judy's door, but it was locked, and no one was inside. Kit didn't allow herself to stop. She sprinted straight to her parents' room. She pounded on the door frantically, nearly losing consciousness in her panic. She screamed, "Dad, please open the door," in utter desperation. But the man kept approaching. His arms reached out toward Kit as if to grab her. His long, filthy fingers were caked with dirt. Kit screamed again, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the man stopped. His demeanor changed. His head tilted as though he'd heard something strange. His eyes gleamed as he mumbled,
"Dad?"
like the word meant something to him. Then he smiled a slow, eerie smile that made Kit's skin crawl, and he began to back away. He didn't turn around, didn't run, just slowly retreated while never taking his eyes off her, as if he was waiting, testing something with Kit. Finally, her parents opened the door, having heard Kit's screams. She rushed inside, tears streaming down her face in terror. Her father decided to search the hallway for the man. Strangely, he had vanished, disappearing quickly into the shadows. She couldn't sleep. The next morning, she was still trembling. As they went down for breakfast at the hotel, she was shocked to see 2 police cars parked outside. Her father was speaking with a police officer, his face serious. When he saw Kit, he called her over and asked her to tell the officers what she had seen the night before. She described the man in as much detail as she could. A family from the floor above had reported that their 7-year-old daughter was missing. The little girl had left her room late at night to get something from the vending machine, but never returned. The police checked the security footage, and there he was, the man Kit had seen, carrying the girl over his shoulder as he walked out of the hotel at 4 a.m. The girl appeared to be asleep, but the police believed she had been knocked unconscious. As the days went by, the memories lingered for Kit. She couldn't sleep, constantly imagining his figure sitting in the corner of her room. Even the smallest noise would send her into a panic, leaving her breathless with fear, and she no longer wanted to leave the house. Her parents eventually sought help from a therapist. The therapist explained to her that everything she was experiencing was normal after witnessing something so traumatic. It was a psychological injury, and Kit would need time to heal. As a witness, Kit followed the case closely. In the end, the case was closed without the police ever finding him. He was just a drifter, a predator. Kit wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to escape the memory of that night, but she knew she needed to move on and become stronger. The ghost of a mother in the forest. I was never someone who truly believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just products of imagination, created to explain the unexplainable. But everything changed when I was in that cursed forest. It was supposed to be a normal overnight trip, and quite an easy one. The locals whispered about the forest being haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The road was rough, and the darkness grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights barely cut through the fog, so I had to be more careful. Then suddenly, she appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the road, hunched over, her eyes fixed on me as I stopped. I honked, but she didn't seem to hear, so I opened the door and shouted for her to move so I could pass. She didn't react at all. Instead, she slowly turned, looked straight at me, and asked, "Have you seen my daughter?" She kept asking, her voice growing more desperate. Then suddenly walked away, sobbing, leaving me confused and shaking. In my mind, I tried to dismiss the encounter with the woman as I continued my journey, but her words kept echoing in my head, gnawing at my sanity. When I finally made it out of the forest at dawn, I stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper was kind, and I chatted with him for a while. But as I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the forest, staring at me. Fear started to creep in, and that's when the shopkeeper told me about her. He said that she had lost her mind after a tragic accident and now wanders the forest, searching for her long-lost daughter. I dismissed the story again, thinking it was just a coincidence. That night, as I drove back through the forest, the rain started pouring down heavily, making the road more dangerous. But I kept going, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, through the rain, I saw another woman. But this time, she wasn't alone, and in her arms was a child who looked frail, almost lifeless. I intended to drive past. I hesitated, but my conscience wouldn't let me. I stopped and asked if they needed a ride. She looked pale, like she'd been out in the rain for too long. She nodded gratefully and climbed into my car with the child in her arms. I handed them a towel to dry off, and then she directed me to a hospital. When we arrived, she quietly thanked me before heading into the building. I sighed with relief, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the back of the car. It was the black umbrella she had been carrying. It was still in my car, and when I turned to look back at the hospital, I was almost paralyzed with what I saw. I looked away for just a few seconds, and when I looked back, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the rain. Feeling confused, I decided it was best to leave as soon as possible. As I neared home, the rain was still pouring, and the parking lot was quite far from my house, so I had to use the black umbrella left in my truck. However, I felt a bit hesitant to use it, remembering that it belonged to the woman and her son, but I had no other choice. As I was walking, a strong gust of wind almost tore the umbrella from my hand, and suddenly, a wooden beam came crashing down from above, about to fall on me. It could have killed me, but the umbrella somehow pulled me to the side, saving my life. Shaking, I realized the umbrella wasn't just an ordinary umbrella. Perhaps it was a gift the woman left behind to protect me. The next morning, I went back to the grocery store, determined to uncover the truth. The shopkeeper hesitated, but finally told me the whole story. The woman and her child were spirits, doomed to wander the forest after a tragic accident. She died trying to protect her son. It happened on a stormy night when she was shunned and refused help by passing travelers. Some even splashed her with mud. She used her body to shield the child, but unfortunately, she slipped and fell off a cliff. On rainy days, if drivers refused to give her a ride, she would mysteriously appear in their cars and haunt them. Feeling a deep sense of injustice, she continues to seek out and punish those who don't help them. The old woman, unable to bear the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandson, went mad shortly after. Since that horrific accident, the villagers have often seen her holding a black umbrella, muttering nonsense. With a heavy heart, I visited their graves, returned the umbrella, and expressed my gratitude. As I walked away, I knew my life had changed forever. I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, and from that day on, I would never doubt their existence again. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something. But there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. "I've been here the whole time." I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it, a door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, he struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, He didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over.
Scary story in the hospital. Nana. She is a nurse with experience working with elderly patients at a geriatric hospital. Today is her extra shift, so she is severely sleep deprived. She was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward love her very much. Tonight, Nana is attending to some patients, but one of them makes her more uneasy than the others. Her name is Len. Not only that, this is a poorly lit hospital room. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with a faint musty odor that sometimes gives her goosebumps and makes her shiver. This is her first night working with Mrs. Len. Len is a middle-aged woman with messy hair and wide, fearful eyes. Every time she enters the room, Len starts talking about the voices she hears and the man in black in the corner of the room. Another woman in the room had requested the curtain to be drawn before her shift started so Len wouldn't be disturbed. The shift starts around 9 p.m., and most patients are asleep by 11 p.m., but not Len. Whenever she calls her in, she speaks with a trembling voice about the voices she hears. The man in black keeps staring from the corner of the room, which frightens her a bit. She has to reassure herself that it's just the medication. She believes that in Len's mind, she is seeing and hearing these things and feels very empathetic. Just imagining those things is very scary. She tries her best to help Len calm down and sleep. Len calmed down and fell asleep after a while. When most of the patients have fallen asleep, time seems to pass very slowly. The corner of the room appears darker, the shadows thicker, and now it has become suffocatingly silent. 1 or 2 hours later, While Nana was in the equipment room to get some supplies, I heard something in the room. The room was quite small and relatively quiet. Strangely, she had closed the door. She immediately turned around but saw nothing and continued to focus on getting the supplies. She tried to focus, but Len's silent warnings echoed in her mind, creating a sense of unease. A moment later, she suddenly felt a cold chill down her neck, as if a hand touched both of her shoulders. Nana looked down at her shoulders and then screamed loudly, but there was nothing there. She looked around and checked the door. There was no one in the room, but she felt a large presence gripping her shoulders. With no other choice, she had to complete her work. She continued loading items onto the cart until it was full. When the supplies were full, the single light bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Nana glanced at a moving shadow reflected on the wall in front of her. She turned around and saw a faint human silhouette reflected in the glass window of the storage room door. The figure was not clear, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood completely still, watching her. Her breath caught, and her hands began to tremble. As she slowly approached, she started screaming loudly and collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw the man in black standing there, smiling eerily through the glass. The scream was loud enough to wake everyone up. The man disappeared from view through the glass door, and a few seconds later, the door opened, and one of her colleagues helped her up. She immediately asked about the man, but there was no one else there besides the two of them. The scream had awakened Mrs. Len, and when she walked in, Mrs. Len was holding her head, repeatedly talking about the voices, the laughter, and the screaming. Nana asked her what the man in black looked like, if he was smiling strangely. But Mrs. Len just focused, frowned, and looked at the corner of the room, terrified. She then said,
"How do you know?"
And Nana began to feel scared, her heart racing, thinking it might be true. Mrs. Len started screaming to be taken out of there and urged to be removed quickly before he arrived. The other nurses came in and tried to help her calm down. That night, due to unstable mental health and overwhelming fear, every creak and groan of the old building startled her. Her nerves were tense and painful, but she vowed to protect her patients from any darkness lurking in the shadows. Determined to find the source of this evil presence, Nana, with a sense of medical duty, returned once more, summoning all her courage as she descended the creaking basement stairs, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in a forgotten basement room, filled with dusty old medical equipment and shelves lined with ancient books. In the center stood an old mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. Nana approached the mirror, feeling a powerful, oppressive energy emanating from it. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the reflection, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Realizing the figure was bound to the mirror, Nana frantically searched the room and found a ritual doll on one of the shelves. An inscription indicated it could be used to banish the spirit. Gathering all her courage, Nana placed the doll down and recited a prayer she had learned as a child, hoping to expel the evil presence. The shadows wavered, and the figure seemed to weaken. But it wasn't enough. The figure screamed in rage as she pressed the cross and the doll against the mirror. The glass shattered with a piercing sound, and the figure disintegrated. The room began to warm, the oppressive feeling dissipating. Everything gradually felt lighter. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. A few days later, Len improved and was discharged from the hospital. Nana continued her work with a new purpose. always vigilant for potential encounters with the otherworldly. This was also a testament to the power of courage and the triumph of light over darkness.
The threat of the gas station customer. Evie had been working the night shift at the gas station for many years. It was always quiet, slow, and uneventful. Her shifts usually started at 8 p.m. every day. The first few hours passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in for gas or snacks. But after 11 p.m., the traffic slowed, and by midnight, the station became eerily quiet. She tried to keep herself busy, organizing merchandise on the shelves and cleaning, but there wasn't much to do. The silence and the ticking of the clock made the second half of her shift feel endless. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into one of the parking spots near the entrance. At first, she didn't think much of it. Most cars came in for gas and left immediately. But this car just sat there. No one got out. She stood up straight behind the counter, waiting for anyone inside to come in. She leaned over the counter, looking through the glass door, but nothing happened. Maybe they were just resting? She shrugged and continued scrolling on her phone, distracted for about 20 minutes. When she looked up from her phone, there, standing in one of the aisles, was a man. He was just there, staring at her. She hadn't heard the doorbell, hadn't seen him walk in. How had he gotten inside without her noticing? The man quickly averted his gaze when he saw her looking. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing a dark coat and a scruffy beanie. There was something about him that made her uneasy. He moved slowly through the aisles, his eyes occasionally glancing toward her, as if assessing whether she was watching him. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. She tried to remain calm, watching him closely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something bad. Suddenly, he turned toward the front door and hurried outside. She dashed out the door, her heart racing. The car was still parked there, but the man walked right past it, disappearing into the darkness along the road. She went straight to the security camera to figure out how he had gotten in without her noticing. She pulled up the footage, scanning through until she found the moment he arrived. The footage showed him stepping out of the parked car, but instead of going inside immediately, he stealthily made his way around to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras there, but she knew those doors were never locked because they were broken. What chilled her the most was the timing. 15 minutes passed between the moment he went behind the building and when he appeared in the store. 15 minutes he spent lurking out of sight, waiting for something. Weeks had passed since that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shift felt like a test for her. One night, while she was cleaning the counters, she noticed something strange. The man entered the store, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and that was when she saw it. Something that seemed horrific. Then he approached her checkout, and she thought she might have guessed right. Dark stains on his sleeve, splotches that looked like blood clinging to the fabric, and he had done something vile and horrible. She wasn't sure if it was the same man, but she sensed it was him by his stature and clothing. She froze, her hands clenched, as he slowly moved down the aisle, seemingly oblivious to her stare. He quickly slipped away, melting into the shadows, and she was left in silence. She resolved to take action. The next time he appeared, she would be ready. A few nights later, he returned. She heard the faint sound of the doorbell and looked up to see him standing right inside, his face hidden in the shadows. She quietly picked up the phone, dialed the police, and kept her voice just above a whisper. She reported the suspicious man, describing his erratic behavior and the blood she had seen on his sleeve. But then, he noticed her. His eyes narrowed, and he realized what she was doing. Without warning, he charged toward her, knocking the phone from her hand. She stumbled back, grabbing anything she could use to defend herself as he backed her into a corner, his face contorted into a disturbing grin. She collided with the shelves, knocking items to the floor. She tried to grab a can from a nearby rack and threw it at him, buying herself a split second to dodge him and run toward the door. But he was quick, grabbing her arm and pulling her back, forcing her against the back of the store. I encouraged myself to survive and reassured myself that the police would arrive soon. He tightened his grip and pressed his face close to hers with a terrifying gaze. She felt panic rising, but she saw the police through the glass. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, then looked at the man's hand on her arm. It was a signal, a silent cue. She knew what she had to do. Gathering all her courage, she turned slightly, catching the man off guard, and bit his hand. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to escape. She stumbled forward, getting out of his reach. The police burst through the door, quickly advancing with their weapons drawn. He hesitated, his face contorted with anger, but he knew he was outnumbered. The officers moved in, bringing him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. He thrashed, his eyes filled with rage as they restrained him. One of the officers approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They said he was a dangerous man, wanted for multiple assaults and murders in the city. She blinked, the reality of his words sinking in. A murderer? The thought sent chills down her spine, and she felt the weight of the encounter heavier than ever. She nodded, grateful that he had finally been apprehended. The man hadn't just been lurking around the police station. He had been hiding, waiting, blending into the shadows, ready to strike. The police finished their reports, and she was left alone in the quiet gas station. The shelves were disarrayed, items scattered after their struggle. The man was gone, but she couldn't shake off the horror of it all. The scars he left would remain with her, a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the light. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, And sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mocking me, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over. You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, Casey, we need to call the police. Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. They're trying to get in, I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Call the police, I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, we need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door. With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, "Maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all."